Good afternoon. My name is Brandon Hamber, and I'm the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair of Peace at Ulster University. And I'd like to warmly welcome you to our seminar today, which is entitled Fire in the Belly, Lessons from Young Women Peacebuilders from Somalia, Libya and Northern Ireland on Inspiring Leaders for Peaceful Change. This is our third seminar in our seminar series exploring youth, peace and security. And we're delighted to have well over 100 of you online with us today. So thank you very, very much for joining us. Our seminar series itself comes out of a report written by Graham Simpson called The Missing Peace, which was for the UN Secretary General and looked at extending Security Council Resolution 2250, which essentially looked at the positive contribution of young people to peace. And our seminar series is our way of trying to take this a little step a bit further. And as we say, exploring those issues, what are the contributions that are happening positively around the world and locally in terms of building peace, particularly by young people. The seminar series itself is a partnership between Ulster University and its Transitional Justice Institute, INCORE, and our Centre for Youth Research and Dialogue, as well as the Youth Pact Project, the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace, the International Fund for Ireland and Interpeace, and of course, the John and Pat Hume Foundation. As I said, our focus today is on lessons from Somalia, Libya and Northern Ireland, and we have some absolutely incredible and inspiring speakers and young leaders to talk to you today. Hajer Sharief, Ilwad Elman and Emma Johnston. They'll be introduced more formally in a short while, but we're delighted that they're with us today. So thank you very much to them. It might come up in the talk. We had a pre-session before this with our speakers and 15 young women leaders to really share lessons in a more intimate setting. So if people refer to the previous session, that's what they are referring to. But it was a way that we could maybe deepen the conversation a little bit. But today and the seminar that you're part of is really about now lifting that up, the local and global voices in particular. And my thanks really to Liz McCardle from Youth Pact for helping organize the smaller session. So that's enough from me. Welcome again to all of you. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my colleague, Professor Monica McWilliams, who probably to most of you on this call may need no introduction, but she's Emeritus Professor of Women's Studies at the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University. She is a board member of the John Hume and Pat Foundation, the John and Pat Hume Foundation, and a former chairperson of Interpeace. So perfectly links all of our partners together, and of course an absolute global expert on women and gender related issues. So Monica, I will hand over to you for the rest of the proceedings, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you for everyone who's here today, and I see my friends from far afield, Eleanor in New Hampshire and Nejla in San Diego, and many others from around the world. So it is wonderful to be connected globally and locally. I'm very privileged that you asked me to chair this session, and having heard Emma and Ilwad and Hija just speaking earlier, and I'll introduce them in a moment, and the connections with young women around the world in terms of peace building is really important, especially at this time for us in Northern Ireland. But let me say a few words first about my dear friend Pat Hume, who passed away this past while and just really missed. And she was someone very close to my heart, and I'm really pleased that the foundation was named in both the names of John and Pat Hume. And I wrote this at the time of John's death last year, and little did I know that so soon Pat would leave us. And at the time I wanted Pat to be honoured, and I said, Pat Hume can move mountains. She had to scale so many obstacles, working alongside her husband John during times of great personal and political risk. She took her husband's good suit to be tried when he was soaked by a water cannon on the streets of Derry in 1968, as far back as then, and I've been recalling some of those days recently in terms of our civil rights movement here. When John set up the Derry Credit Union, She made sure that the money and the accounts were clear. Pat was in her own right a brilliant community politician. She ran the constituency office dealing with community issues, with housing and poverty. And every person, irrespective of religious identity, which tends to be what marks us in this country, she treated them with respect, every one of them, with compassion when they sought her assistance. She stood beside John in a lonely place after he was shunned for taking and talking to men who no one else wanted to talk to. And that was a very difficult and very dangerous time for both of them. She was a brilliant thinker and a close advisor to John at all the key political moments in his life. And after the Shankill bombing, and I remember it well, in 1993, Pat began to doubt if these talks with Sinn Féin would work. But she was convinced by John and by the response of bereaved victims after the Greysteel shooting. And she prayed that, and along with the people at the wake, and I remember that as well, that they would keep going. And indeed they did. So it's fitting that the John and Pat Hume Foundation is named after both of them. And I hope that we can fulfill the Foundation's mission to promote peaceful change and reconciliation. There's so much needed in our troubled land, and what's really the connection between today and Pat's life was that Pat was the spokesperson for the young generation. She distributed the money that we agreed we would put aside at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, of which I'm a signatory, for victims. And one of the ways that we could do that was to ensure that there would be educational grants, assistance with laptops and IT for young people. And I was proud when Pat stood up on platforms and spoke about it. And as I said in the time, people dug deep in their pockets because of their love for Pat, because of her compassion, and because of that absolute commitment that she had to the young generation, to pass the baton on. So that's the connection. So now let me introduce our speakers. Hajer Sharief is a Libyan peace and human rights activist and co-leads the work of the Together We Build It organization in Libya. She's a member of Extremely Together, an initiative by Kofi Annan and the Kofi Annan Foundation. And you're very welcome, Hajer, to this discussion this afternoon. Ilwad Elman is a young female leader at the forefront of the Somalian peace process. She co-founded the Elman Peace Centre and is an advocate for the Kofi Annan Foundation. You're very welcome, Ilwad, and it's great to see you back joining this discussion after the earlier one. And our own Emma Johnston from here in Northern Ireland is a youth worker working with Youth Action and as a representative of the Women's European Platform, which is the UK Joint Committee for Women, and the Irish National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security. So these remarkable young women are here to discuss with this brilliant title. I don't think I've come across one as good. Fire in Belly. I'm going to repeat that every time I go anywhere from now on, to get fire in our belly and to share the lessons on how we can inspire leaders to achieve peaceful change. And I think that's absolutely was at the heart of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. They've taken part in a previous session, which I joined this afternoon, with 8 young leaders from Northern Ireland. And now each will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, setting out their own personal experiences of working with young women. So Emma, over to you. I'm going to probably have the tough job of keeping this to about 10 minutes because we're going to try and get through it and have some questions if possible at the end. So can we open up with you, your work in building the leadership of young women, and what best describes the kind of work that you're doing? And would love to hear your reflections on all of that. So welcome, Emma.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica, and thanks to everybody who organised today. And it's just really lovely to be here in this space. As it's been said, my name is Emma and I'm a youth worker in the Equality Work with Young Women's team in Northern Ireland, in Youth Action Northern Ireland. I've been part of the team since 2008 and I'm based up in the Northwest, up in Derry, Londonderry, and I've had the absolute joy of working with young women on a day and daily basis. So just gonna move on there, Alan. Okay, so just one more there. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, well, I love a good PowerPoint. So I suppose it's already been said, but aside from my youth work and direct engagement with young women, I've spent a big part of my own journey representing the voice of young women on important platforms and spaces that where real change can and does happen. I've been part of Northern Ireland Women's European Platform. We focus on gender architecture locally, nationally, and on a European and international level. We feed into things like the European Women's Lobby on a wide range of women's issues, and we support our sisters across Europe in similar things that they're facing, which again is what today is all about. I've been part of the oversight group of Ireland's third national plan on women, peace and security. And most recently, I got to go to Malaysia to take part in a women, peace and security roundtable with the Commonwealth Foundation. Funny to say that though, because seemingly they were weighing up between Belfast or Malaysia. So I was quite delighted that they did go with Malaysia. I do love Belfast, however, the chance to go to Malaysia was just great. Okay, so just moving on. So I suppose it's important to look at our vision. So as a unit, the Equality Work with Young Women's team, we set out to engage, inspire and support young women who are most excluded from access. So as a regional organisation, we step outside schools and try and engage those young women who are kind of left behind. Because when I think of my own life, and when I think of no matter what kind of day I've had, ups and downs, the bad and the good, when I go home, I am in my safe place. For many young women, this isn't the case. They are living really complex and tricky lives. They face multiple discrimination, which leaves them feeling really vulnerable and marginalised. So we raise their expectations of what the world has to offer them and what they have to offer the world through challenging those traditional expectations and working strategically through training, networking, and developing models of practice and research through influence and policy. Okay, so next slide. So methods, how do we do that? So through youth work, we develop needs-led innovative programs. We provide training for youth workers that looks at gender-based practice and how to have these critical conversations with young women. We influence policymakers and advocate for those making decisions about the lives of young women. Essentially, we love to make a racket and be seen. But I suppose the question is, why do we need this work? And why do we need to strive to engage young women in female-only spaces? Okay, so we're going to move on. So this is why, just the next slide, we continue to live in a patriarchal society. Gender roles, norms, and expectations placed in young women continue to reinforce gender stereotypes. Folks, these messages are everywhere for young women, within the family, religion, through the state, in education, and in the media. These stereotypes form the basis and core of all inequalities, where individuals are treated differently on grounds of gender. This becomes so deeply ingrained in our collective psyche, sometimes it feels like looking good rather than speaking well is given more value for young women. So when it comes to peace building, what are young women telling me? So we're going to move on. As young women, as you can imagine, all of this has a big impact on how young women perceive their place in peace building in Northern Ireland. The sad reality is they feel invisible, left out of the conversation, and have little knowledge of how political structures may impact on their lives. Speaking out and taking a leadership role is not usually expected or encouraged, and they have little confidence to do so. In Northern Ireland, we do continue to have communities that are segregated, and young women feel that divide in both a physical and an emotional sense. We do have single identity communities, schools, which separates religion and backgrounds. Flashpoint times of the year continue with marching season, bonfires, we have Brexit, hey ho, that big one, and also things that divide opinions and create an uneasy atmosphere. In Derry, where I live, we don't necessarily have peace walls, but we have the River Foyle that separates us. So 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, when we're still living with this legacy of the Troubles in a post-conflict society, what works in building leadership in young women? And these are my thoughts. So education, building an education is paramount in nurturing sustainable leadership of young women and raising their confidence to address issues that are affecting them. Education for me breeds empowerment. and creating safe spaces to learn supports their own ability to challenge, to critically analyse areas such as gender equality, and to grasp where they align themselves on their own based experiences. Dialogue is such an important part of building an education, giving space for young women to speak their truth and understand feminism. Okay, next, I feel like visibility is so important. We need to prioritise young women's visibility in spaces that matter. On days like International Women's Day, have them out, present in the public, building that fire in their belly and switching them on to activism. I support young women to recognise why we need to occupy and own spaces. This confidence can dilute these messages that they're growing up with of self-doubt and worry. Because see, when I look at society, I often think, do we really see young women? Do they really see themselves? And do they really see what's going on for them? And when you can turn on that lens, it is really critical in mobilising young women to take action and be agents of change. Okay. So the next is intergenerational opportunities. I believe that the role of intergenerational work is pivotal to sustainable peace, by providing a safe and flourishing space for women from over the generations, from different backgrounds, cultures, countries, religions, can explore critical dialogue, create sharing and learning, role models, mentorship, and allows young women to gain understanding of the role of women in conflict throughout all of our countries and all of our spaces. Okay, next, I believe representation is really important. It's so important that we educate and raise confidence and harness young women to meet and speak with people of influence in our society. Folks, the gap that's between what's happening at a grassroots level where I am and those in decision-making processes need that opportunity to connect, and it needs to be meaningful. So it's not about being tokenistic, it's about educating and building confidence in young women to kind of stand up for what they believe in and recognise their rights. It does take investment though. It's scary to stand up and to represent yourself and those around you. But I believe this is where the personal becomes political, giving space for young women to look at what's going on in their lives and for the people that they love awakens activists and activism. Like, what a gift to give someone, igniting that passion, that drive, their own force and that nature and that wire that does exist within all of us. And then finally is keeping it real and relevant. We need to embark on this journey with young women together. We need to think about what's going on in their lives, the fundamentals of what makes them a young woman. There are a lot of other things going on for them, having this perfect social media presence, sexualization of young women is alive and kicking, mental health, body image. But it's a recognition that life can be overwhelming, but when we work together, we can channel our energy towards other areas of our lives. And I suppose for me, it's about showing up. It's about keeping it fun, keeping it innovative and dynamic, building programs that focus on progression rather than perfection. And by that, making mistakes, this is how we learn our best information. Okay. So just before I finish, there's two practice examples which I thought I would share. So the first is Pizza and Politics. Pizza and Politics is a hustings event that I host at every election, every chance that I get, basically. And I suppose the idea is if I call it politics, nobody will show up. However, when you add in some pizza, it usually works. And what I do over the event is take the young woman into a space with youth workers for the first session. And we look at things that impact on their lives, but we try and unpick politics. So using a Mentimeter, I ask the question and I say to the young woman, write down the first thing comes to your head when you hear the word politics. And as you can imagine, it's like, oh, you know, quite negative things like, oh, it's boring, waste of time, not relevant to me. And we discuss that. The second thing I ask them is, what are the first words you hear when you hear the word voting? And again, it's quite negative. Why bother? I'm not registered. I never vote and so on. But the third question I ask is, what are you most passionate about? And this is where the energy shifts and they start to come up with things like LGBTQ rights, mental health, more housing for young mums. And then they recognize that everything that we're doing and everything we're talking about is political, whether it's small p or big P politics. And they're able to come up with questions. So when the representatives come in, they feel that confidence, they know what they want to ask. And we finish with a mock voting booth. So every politician has 3 minutes to put the onus on them to inspire the young woman to vote for them, essentially. Then the young woman go through that process of getting into a mock voting book or booth and voting. But the most hilarious thing that happened at the last event was in the first session, I said to the young woman, look, these guys are coming, you know, they've lives, they're giving up their time for us. So we need to make sure that we are respectful. You might not agree with their politics, however, you know, we need to like give them the space and respect who they are and what they believe in. The unfortunate thing was that after going through that agreement and preparing the young people, the elected representatives started to fight with each other in the middle of the session. So it was around the time of the expenses debate. So all the young women were looking at me with their hand over their mouth, you know, like, oh, they're fighting. And I was like, oh, it's okay. And I suppose at the time it was quite hilarious, but it also didn't like nurture the fact that we do have a very unstable political systems in place, and that political continues to be quite aggressive in its way. So that's the first, pizza and politics. The second one I wanted to talk about is a Let's Talk Young Women event that we do. And Let's Talk Young Women is developed by young women for young women, where they look into areas of young women's lives that they would like to tackle. And we do a word cafe style event. And we focus on things like peace building and activism. I have the right. So what have you the right to as a young woman? Consent, which is obviously a very big issue that we're facing at the moment, and social media, and then mental health and young women in leadership. And the young women are hosted by organizations who have expertise in each of these areas and bring them through a process where they learn about them, and then they're able to inform recommendations based on what they've learned. So for example, in the I Have the Right workshop, we had young women saying, I have the right to express my views freely. I have the right to practice my religion safely. I have the right to be me, and I have the right not to live in poverty. I have the right to feel safe always. Really powerful stuff. So just to conclude, I always use these 3 C's. I love a good C. I don't know why. I just love a word starting with a C. But I think 3 key messages I'd like to leave you with. The first C is collaboration. Let's pull together all of our resources. Let's make collective decisions and breathe positive energy into the lives of young women in this time of change. Let's promote their participation at all levels in public and political life and invest in the resources to make this happen. The second C is critical thinkers. Oh my goodness, it would be so boring to be in a room full of Emmas. Let's build and encourage young women to think critically and to ask questions about their lives. Let's educate and inform them to make up their own minds and challenge the status quo that we continue to live in. And my third C is compassionate leadership. So let's show young women we care, and let's speak up for them on their behalf at any opportunity that presents itself. Let's support young women to feel part of our political landscape, expose them to information, opportunities, so they can take action to create positive change, that we are listening and that we understand their world. And for me, this is most important. So thanks so much. Thanks for listening. I'm really excited to hear the other 2 speakers. So back to you, Monica.
Thanks very much, Emma. That was very useful. And to your 3 C's, I'm going to add a few more, which came through my life in terms of the things that held me back as a young woman, which was culture and customs, cash, confidence, and childcare. So it looks like it's going to be one of those days with lots of C's and plenty to discuss afterwards. But thank you so much for that. I'm now going to pass over to Hajer Sharief to tell us about your life in Libya and the amazing work which I've been reading about that you've been doing on peace building. So over to you, Hija.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you for everyone who's put the effort to put this event together. Let me tell you how I started this work. As all of you know, in 2011, there was a revolution that took place in Libya. And it started as a peaceful revolution that wanted to change the regime, but it also, of course, had the demands for human rights, democracy, peace, stabilization, and so on. So in 2011, I was very excited about this change. And I was one of the people who, of course, hoped, or at least at the time thought that all what is needed to achieve peace, security, stability, human rights, and democracy was just a regime change. And few months after the revolution started, of course, there was also an armed conflict element that was happening parallel to the peaceful revolution as well. And then suddenly, out of the blue, many Libyans found themselves in the middle of a war that was taking place. But however, at the time, I'm also one of the people who didn't really understand the depth of the fact that the society was living through a war. And many of us thought, you know, once the revolution ends, then things are going to be okay. Although there was, of course, the spread of arms, weapons, etc., no one seemed to really thought about the aftermath of what's going to happen. And at that time, I was studying medicine. I was 19 years old. And then when the war reached my city, Tripoli, I volunteered to work at the hospital because there was a shortage in the staff. Many of the medical staff were not able to reach the hospital because of the fightings happening in the streets. So there was announcement that the hospitals needed volunteers who have a medical background or students of the medicine school to come and volunteer. And I remember the minute I walked into the hospital, sort of my whole view on what was happening changed, because throughout the months of the revolution / the armed conflict, all what we heard, all what we saw on the news, and the dominant narrative was that those who get affected by armed conflicts and wars are only those who are at the front lines. So it's the young men holding the weapons, fighting each other at the front lines. These are the only ones who will get killed. These are the only ones who will get injured. And from the very first day at the hospital, I realized that that was not nearly the full story. That was, of course, part of the story. But the full story is the fact that civilians got injured, got killed, got affected by the armed conflict directly. And I remember that was the waking up call for me, in the sense of the realization that changing the regime is not enough. What is needed is much more than that. What is needed is work on the community level, on the local level, but also on the national level. And that's what inspired me to co-found the Together We Build It organization. And I was 19 at that time. I co-founded it with few friends and also university professor. And I must admit, at that time, I thought I sort of started an invention. Libya was very closed, as all of you know. Under the previous regime, there was no space for civil activism or political activism. So there was no culture of civil society organizations, nonprofits, etc. The only form of organization that was allowed under the previous regime was those who were purely working on charity causes. And even that, it wasn't really much of a safe space. So imagine 19 years old me telling my other co-founders about this idea, literally thinking that I'm starting something new that was never done before in any part of the world. And of course, as you can imagine, soon later, I was disappointed by knowing that, well, this is a whole sector, and there is not only civil society, but there is the UN, there is all of these different organizations working on an international level, but also the local level and the national level, as my idea was for the organization at the time. So we started the Together We Build It organization. And I remember when we were sitting thinking of sort of trying to develop our mission statement. That was in 2011, and we said, what we want to do, we want to work on the community. We want to focus on women and young people and encouraging to play an active role in the peaceful democratic transition of the country. And then not too long after that, another armed conflict took place. And then we sort of have to revise our mission statement to say, well, hold on a second, peace and security is not really what we all thought that it was, in the sense of it's not really well defined under the formal narrative that peace and security is something rigid, that it requires professionals to work on it. It's the hardcore issues that only political leaders should be engaged with, because of course, this is what the processes at the times were like. And we sort of had to redefine what peace and security is for us, in the sense of saying, well, our philosophy is that peace is a public good, which means that everyone should have the right to it, and everyone should have the right to participate in working on peace. And when it comes to when it comes to countries affected by conflict, that means that everyone should have the right to participate in building, making, and shaping peace. But also when it comes to contexts and countries that perhaps are not undergoing armed conflicts, it's also people's right to participate in building and sustaining peace. And this is the philosophy that we adopted, and this is what we believe in the sense of mainstreaming this philosophy throughout all the work that we do. Our focus is mainly to work on empowering women and also encouraging women and young people to play an active role in peace and security and peace building, and also advocating for the right of these groups, women and young people, to be part of formal peace processes. And perhaps this is one of the challenges that we face the most, in the sense of, if you look at countries that are affected by conflict, but also what was very clear from the conversation we had before this event in the private session, that this is not only limited to countries like Libya, Somalia, but it's also to other countries who are perhaps not undergoing active armed conflicts right now, is the fact that young women are sort of facing a double exclusion from peace processes, particularly formal peace processes. Because let's not forget the fact that women in general are excluded from these processes, and young women face a double exclusion. They are excluded because they are women, but they are also excluded because they are young people. And that's why in our organization in 2018, we decided to formally adopt a co-leadership approach to peace and security. And this is so to say that young women and other groups, but including women as well, should have the formal right to participate in peace building, peacemaking, peace processes, whatever the format of the peace work that is taking place. Another thing that is also very important for all of us who are engaged in the peace building work, regardless what it is, because working on peace is also very technical. There is all of these different terminologies, making, sustaining, building, and it means different things to so many different people. But for us, we're saying, in order to really build peace, we need to redesign the peace table, regardless of whatever category it fits in, because we cannot continue having these formal peace processes that only focus, for an example, on political settlements and expect that perhaps peace activists on the ground will find their space within these processes. In order for us to ensure that everyone have the right to participate and are playing the role that they should be doing, then we need to redesign the peace table, and we need to redesign how we do our peace work generally. So this is a little bit from my side And I'm very much looking forward for the conversation later.
Thank you so much for that. It's really inspiring, and it does show the importance of civil society, and something we believe in greatly here, as you just heard from Emma. The tremendous work that both of you are doing in completely different parts of the world. And no doubt we're going to hear the same now, again from Somalia. So Ilwad, the floor is yours, and you're very welcome. It's great to see you here, and I've also heard so much about you. So it's great to see you in person.
Thank you very much, Monica, for the warm introduction and for the opportunity to join you today for this important seminar dedicated to experiences of young women peace leaders, appropriately titled Fire in the Belly. I've dedicated my life to supporting young women and girls to gain the skills and confidence to become leaders in their community, because in my context and work, I see every day how they are overlooked members of society. In my country of Somalia, they experience inequality in nutrition, medical care, and education, although they are disproportionately affected by war and conflict and in the greatest need of these services. But when young women and girls' leadership and peace-building potential is realized, they are a force that transforms communities and societies. Like Hajer mentioned, young women, they don't fit in the youth box, which often means young elite men. And they don't fit in the women box, which often means older elite women. But they are daring, innovative, and uniquely placed to build peace where so many others have failed. A process I have been fortunate to witness countless times over in my work in Somalia, but I've also witnessed globally. In the event prior to this one, I saw the determination and passion from young women in Northern Ireland that further affirmed that young women can lead and solve the seemingly intractable conflicts of this world when given the support, platform, training, and resources to. They do this out of fed-upness, necessity, and because no one can represent them like them. I'm grateful to the John and Pat Hume Foundation, Ulster University, and Interpeace for giving us the opportunity to connect today, and also for the reminder that even halfway across the world, our issues and our priorities are so similar. And in a world where there is just so much othering, it is ever more important to reflect on what we are collectively for and not just what we are against. When I heard from the young women in the past session talking about the challenges in their communities that they are trying to solve, the narratives of identities under threat that exist, the invincible borders and man-made barriers, I couldn't help but reflect on those being our very same realities in Somalia. And Hajer may agree with me of similar realities in Libya. And as we look to global solutions and frameworks for international cooperation, every opportunity for remembering our shared humanity in these difficult journeys for building peace that we are on is so valuable. So thank you again for convening us here to explore that fire that burns so deeply in all of our bellies. I work at the Elman Peace Centre in Mogadishu, Somalia. 78% of the population in my country is under the age of 30. We have been in conflict for 3 decades. An entire generation has only ever known war. And in this context, my organization is a woman-led institution with more than 60% of our staff female, and of course, 70% of our workforce made up of youth. Our work spans operationally throughout Somalia, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Great Lakes regions of Africa. But our advocacy is global. We work on disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration of young people that are being co-opted by armed groups or terrorist organizations. We focus on security sector reform that is inclusive of women and youth. We work on human rights and political participation and many more developmental services that allow young people to reach their potential, even during times of war, in the absence of a state to do so. In my organization, young women play a critical role in advancing the rights of women and girls, challenging inequality, and holding those in power to account. But this is being done in the current global context of unchecked authoritarianism, along with the rise of populism, polarization, and fundamentalist groups that are all contributing to a shrinking space for civil society. In my context, the shrinking civil society space is being done through the enactment of laws and practices that effectively impede human rights, including the misapplication of certain laws such as counterterrorism, and even newer laws that threaten the future of women, such as the Sexual Intercourse Bill, which was introduced in Somalia in 2020, that initially was a sexual offenses bill that was put in place to hold perpetrators to account, but was so grossly perverted by the parliament into a bill that now legalizes child marriage. Young women also face the additional barrier of economic and other structural discrimination and unique challenges driven by deep-rooted discrimination against women and stereotypes that are entrenched in patriarchal societies related to gender and sexuality. Moreover, sexual violence, defamation, intimidation, including against their family members, are being used as a deterrent for girls and young women to be involved with peace-building work. Young women are at a heightened risk of attacks and violence when working in areas such as peacebuilding, and often challenged by fundamentalist groups. I know this firsthand, having lost countless of colleagues, my father, and most recently my sister in 2019, all in pursuit of peace. But we still continue to fight for and negotiate peace at the front lines every day, because young women are pivotal in promoting sustainable peace. Yet they are constantly excluded from peace processes, politics. They're often criminalized, and they experience gender-based violence, which hampers their participation in decision-making processes. I'm so fortunate to know so many young women who, in the face of such extreme insecurity, continue to promote international human rights law, to mobilize society in identifying human rights violations, and contribute to developing solutions with a gender perspective. And what I have found to be the most effective way of supporting young women peace builders is to listen to them. And I draw much of my own experience in this journey too, as a young woman peace builder who started her own journey at the age of 19. What I needed was support to strengthen my capacity, to promote and protect the rights of others and my own, and to fully realize my leadership potential. So this is what I now invest in through my organization, what I needed then, ensuring that the challenges I faced are not experienced by young women who want to get involved today. Practically, young women want to develop their leadership skills and explore leadership strategies. They want to learn about resolutions like WPS 1325 and the Youth Peace and Security Resolution, where these instruments and others have failed, how they can be operationalized. They want to work with others and have resources to implement their ideas, not to just talk about challenges. They don't want to be beneficiaries of international processes that have been cooked up for them already. They want to analyze local peace and security conditions and design peace-building initiatives within their community. And they want to learn skills that will actually help them do their work, not to just be celebrated or tokenized or victimized. And most importantly, young women want to graduate from this non-threatening box on the margins, and they want to lead. So we invest in a range of other skills as selected and prioritized by them, from effective use of traditional and digital media, to climate change and security, to electoral models and campaigning and political participation, and developing and running their own trainings to support other harder to reach young women in their communities. Our ultimate goal in this work is to empower young women with the tools they need to be independent peace builders within their communities. And when you hear of incredible women like Hajer and Emma, and you hear my story, that you don't think we are an anomaly or the exception, but in fact that we are the norm. And I'm glad that today we are not discussing can young women lead, but showcasing that they do. If there's anything that we learned or that we can be grateful for during the COVID pandemic, is that when crisis happens, yes, women and girls are doubly affected. And in too many places in the world, we saw women and girls trapped with their abusers. But in much of the conflict affected and fragile states, mine included, we also saw the international community and UN missions packing up and leaving. And it was the women who stayed behind to care for their communities during the lockdowns. So if we can trust and build and partner with them when everyone is gone, why is it that when these actors return, the same type of partnership and trust is not upheld? Why is it that we just celebrated 20 years of the resolution 1325, the resolution for the inclusion of women in peace-building processes? But when political violence ensued in my country just a couple of weeks ago, and we had an opportunity to implement this resolution, the international community convened 5 men to broker the ceasefire. Why does patriarchy continue to rear its ugly head when we have the chance to implement these resolutions and frameworks we've invested so much in? Because we still have so much work to do. I think that's the short answer, but don't think that women and young women are waiting to be included. They are continuing to organize on the margins, using their influence to de-escalate conflict where they can, and convince their youth male peers to not be coerced into armed conflict. These documents, commitments, declarations are just the beginning. And they're incredibly important tools, the 2250 resolution and the progress study particularly, because they detailed in great length how young people are positively involved in peace and security through empirical evidence from all around the world. But now that we have them, what we do with them is even more so important. 5 years from now, 10 years on, I don't want us to be celebrating resolutions, but actually holding governments who have voluntarily committed to them to account on what they have done to improve participation, partnerships, and protection of youth in these processes. Thank you.
So now I'm back again to all of you. Those were 3 very powerful, very inspirational inputs that we've just received. And I can see from the chat line that everyone's saying, how do we stay involved? How do we stay involved? So that's an incredible outcome already. And thank you so much for that. So I'm inviting everyone now who's listening in to stick up their questions on the chat line. They'll be monitored and I'll try and get to them. And so far what I'm seeing is, wow, brilliant talk, wonderful contribution, so amazing, so stimulating. So I just wanted you 3 to hear that, because I always find that you need to be empowered, encouraged and thanked for your work. And I will give you personally a very heartfelt thanks this afternoon for what you're doing. It's incredible. The connections that I make between the 3 of you is about the need for visibility. It's incredible that Emma started out talking about representation and visibility, and that's the connection that I see in all 3. How to shape the peace is what we've heard. And this concept that we use here too, about an armed peace, about how to keep young women, when the focus is on young men, to keep them away from the armed groups and the paramilitaries. How do we focus on the role of young women in that, so that they're not left on the sidelines? What does an armed peace mean? And again, the connection between all 3 of you is, how do we keep it real? Those words again, how do we keep it relevant? And look what we just heard about the laws that are being introduced and the policies that are being introduced, and who they're coming after. And what we know is that women want freedom from want, but they also want freedom from fear. So let's look at that. You all started out 19 teenagers with fire in your belly. And all these years later, you still have that fire. So I'm going to ask you to maybe connect with each other for a moment, and say something that you found in terms of that connectedness. It certainly connected with me. Emma, maybe I could start with you in what you've picked up from our sisters in Somalia and in Libya.
I suppose from this session and the previous session, I think a lot of what we've been talking about is how much we are all on the same page, considering we exist, miles apart. So for me, it kind of brings to the fore the recommendation that we need to be looking at young women and women as individuals, obviously, because we can't put a blanket on every young woman being the same or every woman being the same, but that we need to get the global perspective down and more apparent. Like, I do think, like in Northern Ireland, sometimes because of things that have happened, we can be very insular in how we look at our views. When look at the models of practice, look at the inspiration, look at the work that these 2 are doing, like that I can certainly learn from. And we may be in different places in terms of where we're at, in terms of conflict. But again, that's such a strength to be able to, and we have these mechanisms online now. Obviously, they're not ideal, but I suppose it's about how can we breathe that energy through collaboration on a more global perspective. Because for me, especially in Northern Ireland, I feel like we are often doing our politicians a favour by not acting in our small groups and not connecting the dots, and they're getting on with it. So we need to be visible. We need to be challenging them. We need to be standing up, advocating, and bringing everyone together, because more so than ever, we are so connected globally. And I think the pulling of that resource collectively can just, we can move mountains, folks. Let's do it.
And Emma, one of the questions, I'm looking at the chat line here, and one of the questions from Nina McCann was, how can, as a 65-year-old, can he connect with younger generation, which is a tall order, but I think, Ilwad, you answered some of that, and so did you, in terms of the amazing stuff I'm hearing, Hajer, from the listening, just listening to younger voices. When Graham Simpson wrote that report on the missing piece, what came out was that you're on the table, but you're not at the table. And I think that's incredibly powerful language. Stop talking about young people if they're not at the table. The young people should be at the table, young activists, and shaping that piece. So, Neil, I guess the answer would be to support, include younger voices and hearing what they have to say. And I see someone's posted up that something is happening, and Michelle Simpson said that they've got a project in Derry, conversations with older generations through the International Fund for Ireland. And that's fantastic. I'm delighted to hear that. So that's really good. I'm going to turn now to both Hija and Ilwad to ask the same question. What did you take from each other? Let me start with you, Ilwad. What did you pick up from what you just heard from either Youth Action in Derry or wonderful supporter here and advocate in Northern Ireland? So far away.
Well, I think that, I mean, what we heard in the remarks from both Emma and Hajer, and also in the private session before, is that although young people, young women particularly, are not homogenous groups, we are facing very similar challenges. Challenges to inclusion and participation primarily. And we have the solutions. Many of us have formed organizations, are part of movements, have been working on the margins of official processes for a very long time. So we know what we need. And it's both reaffirming to hear that the approaches that we've applied in Somalia are also being applied in Northern Ireland. And we see that there is similarity there, but it's very frustrating that we're facing the same challenges halfway across the world. And I think that, like Emma mentioned, this creates an opportunity for a continued dialogue, continued cooperation, and building off of each other's work and experience. In the private session, I mentioned that for many of us that are still working in much more restrictive environments or in conflict zones, that there are certain things that are difficult for us to speak about publicly. But when we create partnerships with other youth that are in other countries that are maybe easier for their governments to be held to account, or they can speak more freely, that level of solidarity and support can help amplify our work. So there's always opportunities for cooperation. If there's one thing that I think youth organizations and youth activists do better than governments or multilateral organizations or even UN systems, is how inclusive they are, how gender sensitive they are, and how intersectional they are too in the issues that they work. And there's much to be learned from how young people organize amongst themselves more equally and more inclusively. And I think this also relates to how young people are always extending the olive branch for other actors to be a part of their work. The question we had earlier is, how can someone that is 65 support our work? I think young people create environments where they want to have intergenerational dialogue. We want to leverage your proximity, your privilege to create more space and opportunities for us. In my work in Somalia, what I find is that I recognize myself to be a constituent of privileged youth. But even for me to be able to navigate certain political spaces or to advocate on certain issues, I require individual champions within government or within political parties to help me navigate that space. What we are asking for is institutional processes, so I don't have to rely on an individual. But until those institutional appointments or mandates are in place that guarantee young people's participation, we look to individuals who have that access to support us. And often people who are more open to young people who support them, they also face challenges and are not there forever. So I think that the biggest thing that you can do to support young people in their movements, in their plights, is to think about where you are uniquely placed to support them, whether it's access, network, or opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Ilwad. Hija, the same kind of point, but also questions come in about what type of resistance have you faced and your organization, and how do you overcome those? And you've already set up your own organization, so you've probably got some resistance even by its title, which I think is a wonderful title. So maybe you could tell us something about that, the resistance that you're facing, because we've just heard from Emma and Ilwad, about the resistance that we face as women in our society. But in terms of your conflict, let's connect back in here to peace building in particular. I know that's a tough one, but the floor is yours.
Absolutely. It's at the surface, the resistance is literally the same. I know the context in Somalia from Ilwad because I had also the pleasure of knowing her now for a few years. But I was very surprised listening to Emma and the other women in the private session earlier. And this is something we talked about as well, in the sense of it's literally the recognition that the resistance and exclusion young women face in peace building processes, for an example, in mediated and facilitated formal peace processes, but also in all decision-making processes, are literally the same. Because in my part of the world, when women are excluded and when young women are excluded, it's always the traditions and the religion that is blamed. And this also comes from, for an example, from international actors, the peace mediators and facilitators, the external ones. And the situation in Libya, as many of you know, is very much heavily influenced by external mediators and facilitators of peace processes. It's almost led entirely by the international community. And whenever we went to them throughout the past years, whenever we went to them and we said, well, women need to be part of these processes and young women also need to be part of these processes, they also pointed the finger at the national decision makers, for an example, by saying, well, the official delegations, when they came to the talks, they didn't bring women. But we're also smart enough to know how these processes are designed. Because if you're hosting a party and you're sending invitations, you are the one responsible on who's coming to this party. And it's something very similar to the peace processes that you facilitate and mediate. If you are inviting specific groups, even if you are inviting delegations of the government, the parliament, different political actors, you need to ensure that the process you're hosting and even the invitation you're sending is actually an invitation that will enable women and young women to be part of these processes, because you cannot send out an invitation and convene a whole process where you're claiming that this is a process that wants to achieve peace and you're only inviting 4 men to it. This happened in Libya and we heard that it happened in Somalia, but also from the examples the others earlier shared during the private session, it's happening everywhere. And it's very important to recognize the root causes of the exclusion, because it should be no longer accepted from anyone to say, well, women and young women are excluded because of religion, tradition, social customs and values, while it's actually the process and the design of the process in itself is by nature exclusive.
That's absolutely. And what I found was we spend a lot of time building capacity when in fact it's the process keeping us out. It's the system that's keeping us out. We've got our capacity, we've got our confidence. All we have to do is look at you and Emma and Ilwad. There's the confidence, the capacity, the skills. So what's happening inside this system that only, as we heard earlier, only 90%, well, not only, 90% of our politicians are men and 10% are women. So what is going on in the system? And that connects to a question in terms of feminism and peace building, something that's dear to my heart. Ilwad, you've talked about it in your talk about these laws that are coming in, these policies that are coming in. We've had them here and the patriarchy is pretty strong everywhere. The dinosaurs are everywhere. And tell us something about your role in feminist and peace building. That has to be tough in Somalia.
It is tough, but I think that on that point, exactly how you put it, between feminism and peace building, I mean, the pursuit of peace or de-escalating tensions or a ceasefire is more important or prioritized than the participation of women in these processes. It's considered a box to tick after. I'll give you an example. In 2016, when we still don't have a democratic process fully in Somalia, but the hybrid system that we're working in at least provides for some participation. In 2016, there was a massive women's movement calling for a 30% quota for women's political participation. Women advocated, the international community was on board, and they actually made it conditional that the 30% quota be met before the rest of the electoral process goes on. The 30% was not reached, but very close, around 23%. What that created was an influx of women at the National Assembly, in ministerial roles, participation they would have never ever had if that quota was not put in place. What happened just a few weeks ago was that the same energy, the same momentum, the same kind of conditions were not enforced by the international community, the Friends of Somalia. They completely abandoned the goal of women's political participation and instead sought a very fast and lazy solution to just de-escalate tensions by getting the same 5 men in the room. And what happened there is that the prioritization of de-escalating tensions completely has now closed the door on women being able to fight for that 30% quota. So when we think about building peace and building states, especially in fragile scenarios like Somalia, we can't think of women's participation as an optional second, but it has to be a fundamental priority that is part and parcel of any credible process. And that is a big challenge. And I see that one of the questions that we have in the chat as well is, how is it possible to bring women in mainstream to be part of peace building processes in fragile states? I think it's, again, very lazy to say that, are women interested? Is their capacity built? Are they willing to challenge the cultural and traditional barriers? They always are. Feminism is, we heard as well in the private session, that it is not a dirty word, but in Northern Ireland, in, across the world, in Somalia, in many places, feminism is considered to be a dirty word, but still women are defiantly pushing for processes that ensure the well-being. And they know that in order to participate, that is the only way that they will create changes. And
And I'm thinking, like, Interpeace is also linked in here today, is to make sure that monitoring happens. I mean, the story you've just told us, who was monitoring that? Who said this is the one and only priority? The women can watch and wait. We'll get round to you at some stage, especially young women. That isn't how you sustain peace, which you've just said. So the connection there is, for all of us who are involved in this and whatever capacity internationally, is to make sure those kinds of things don't happen, and to allow it to happen in Somalia, where you've fought so hard to get that place, and only to be told now that, I guess, you mentioned five wise men. How often have I heard that? The 5 wise elders. And that's repeated and repeated. So I'm going to link this on to another question, which tends to come up and maybe quite tough one to answer, is how do you include young men in these discussions? I'd love every time we have one of these, when the young men are having the opportunity to ask, how do you include young women? But here today, we're young women with us. How do we include the young men? And Emma, there's a question for you on how to, about youth clubs and youth organisations. Are they inclusive enough? So Hija, let's go to you on this one on young men. What's it like in Libya? Supportive, inclusive, encouraging, empowering? Do they stand alongside you, in other words, and say, go on, good on you. Let me see if I can help you.
I would definitely say that the active young men in Libya and the youth organizations are definitely more inclusive than national actors, but also international actors who are working on Libya. And this will actually link me to the fact that in my work for the past 10 years, of course, there is inclusion from Libyans themselves, in the sense, for example, from national actors. But there is also exclusion from the international actors, and they don't both weight the same, because when it comes to national actors, but also other Libyan actors, it's very easy for us to say, look, we are equal citizens, and if you think that women should not be part of these processes, then that's just your opinion. But when it comes to exclusion that we face from international actors, and I'm mainly focusing on peace mediators and facilitators, I must say that's the most frustrating one. And this will link me to a question that is also in the chat. Someone was asking about if we ever had the experience of being put down. I never faced an experience of being put down by a young man in Libya, for an example, who is active in these fields, and that's a testament for how inclusive they are, more than any other actors who are not, of course, solely focusing on women's rights and gender equality. But I've had international mediators and facilitators who convened peace processes in Libya who said to me, whenever I argued with them about, for example, that their processes did not include women, when they were solely responsible on who entered that room and who sat on the table. And I've been told by some of them that, for an example, you need to be realistic. This whole discussion about including women, you know, the situation in Libya, the conflict in Libya, and it's really frustrating for me to be a Libyan and listening to someone who's not Libyan, who's convening a process on Libya, telling me what's the situation in Libya and what's the armed conflict in Libya and what's the best solution. And Ilwad mentioned something, I would say that should be really a slogan whenever we see a peace process that is not inclusive. It's fast and lazy, because whenever there's a conflict, the easy solution is let's bring the men to the table and let them agree. And the funny thing is that even if they agree, everyone knows that deep inside they don't agree. They're gonna leave the room, they're gonna fight again, but no one ever say that's a peace process that failed. Everyone says, well, building peace is difficult and it takes time. But we should start saying that peace agreement failed, that process failed, in order for us to reach the root causes of the issues and actually reach a design of a peace process that brings everyone into the room. Because if we only keep inviting these few men, then it's very fair that only these few men are going to negotiate on behalf of their own favors, while leaving all other priorities of the people, human rights, humanitarian needs, and all of these important fundamental issues for peace outside of the peace table.
Thank you, Hija. Yeah, we've all had that same experience that you've just pointed to, which is don't be raising your expectations too much. We have more serious business here, when in fact those expectations are deadly serious. There's what's sustaining peace. So Emma, I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer that about how the youth organisations could be more inclusive of women, young women in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to make the point, sorry Emma, that the International Fund for Ireland, I'm very familiar with their peace projects, and I am really pleased to see those projects on the ground. That's the new work, and in the past, we were so risk adverse in terms of, oh, I wonder, should we fund this? That's the work that's working. That's where the resilience is happening. And it was so good there to hear, Hija, you talking about those young men being respectful. I just hope that that continues to cross boundaries and international borders, that respect that we so much need for the work you're doing. Emma?
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, Hija, like, amazing, like just thinking about what you're talking about, like there's so much ego, there's so many egos in peace building, and I think that's one of the biggest issues. It's like, so you have a table, you invite people to the table, but it's not just about what they bring to the table, it's about their ego, it's about their agenda, and it's about what it is they're trying to, like, what the goal is, do you know? And I think like there is that idea of, if there isn't room at the table, get a bigger table, do you know? Like that's the true essence of it. How are we looking around the table, and how are we looking at who is represented? Like, and it's not just about religion, or it's about intersectionality. It's about, you know, I don't know, it's just about trying to see the world in a way that somebody has written, not patriarchal, that it's an inclusive world, that we're all humans and we all have, you know, things that we need in terms of being able to flourish. But anyway, sorry, back to the question. I think the question's around women's organizations and what we can do, and just to shout out to all of the women, you know, within the women's organizations that were there through thick and thin, through the troubles, supporting other women, you know, at the front of it all, when, you know, things were like really, really bad in terms of the troubles and violence and all of them things, holding it together, the glue, all of those things. But I do think that in some ways, women's organizations, even though they really, really want to do more with young women, that kind of culture maybe still exists, and it just needs shook up a wee bit. So that whole idea of keeping it real and relevant is something that we need to kind of, you know, bring into the women's organizations. And I'm part of some women's organizations, and I try to do that. And I suppose that's the key thing. And same with the man who asked about intergenerational work. It's that none of us should be thinking that we're holding a hot ball, or, you know, that we're, you know, I monopolize on young women because I work with them. They're my young women. They are not my young women. They're young women in their own right. And I think that whenever we start to pass the hot ball and find out who has the expertise, so bring in maybe somebody that's got a wee bit of youth work experience into a women's centre, you know, doing a wee bit of a needs assessment, you know, what are young women looking for, what, you know, then we can all start to work together to provide the best services where people can get that education, or, you know, have critical conversations, dialogue, you know, intergenerational opportunities. So I suppose it's about looking, like lifting our head up and looking around us and seeing what we can connect to build that nurturing space for all women, I suppose.
Can I ask, because what you're actually talking about is probably what happens in a lot of peaceful countries. And all three of you have lived through what we would call war-torn societies in many ways, which makes the situation more difficult. So how do you stand up and speak out when there's a backlash, when there's egos, when there's toxic masculinity? And each one of you have worked with organizations. Indeed, some of you have founded your own organizations. How much solidarity do you get? Let's start in Somalia with your foundation, in terms of support, solidarity, pushing you forward, saying, this is a really important organization, we must include that voice. Has there been resistance? Is there backlash? How do you deal with threats, given what you're doing is so creative and so innovative? So, Ilwad, let's start with you on that one.
Maybe I'll actually just take the question just before that as well, too, because I think it links well about the role of young men in these processes, too. I come from a context where we have an overwhelming majority of young people. Like I mentioned, 78% of the population is under the age of 30. All youth, women, young men are looked at as a threat. The government is terrified of this huge population. So they keep them deprived, exclude them from processes, because they think, and as we've seen most recently, there have been various revolutions happening where young people are demanding change from their governments. So young people in Somalia have already been labeled as perpetrators or potential perpetrators. And through the Missing Peace report and the progress study, we saw that this is a narrative that plagues young people across the world, where they are viewed as a big question mark. Are they peaceful, or will they one day turn and be violent? The way that young men are also viewed in Somalia is that they're often looked at as just the problem. When we talk about sexual violence, when we talk about harmful traditional cultures, but we see them as also part of the solution. I find a lot of hope and possibility with this huge demographic of young people, because that means that all of these challenges that we face in our country are only one generation young. And young people right now at the age they are malleable, they're adaptable. And when given pathways and opportunities for a dignified alternative to conflict and war, they are 9 times out of 10 more likely to participate in that than something that is detrimental to their well-being and that of their community. And I think that's important to think about as well, too, when we look at young men being supportive to women in politics, women in leadership. Like Hajer mentioned, we put these labels on communities that we think would not allow for this without actually exploring the concept. And what I see, even in a place like Somalia, is that young men are open to women leadership and want to be a part of that when given the opportunity to. And in my work, we do work on very challenging issues. We work on preventing and countering violent extremism. We work on the disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration of young people that were co-opted into groups that are designated by designated terrorist groups. We work with survivors of sexual violence. We do public advocacy, and that comes with a lot of risks. And I don't want to oversimplify it by any means, but for many of us, that do this work, it is both an occupational hazard, the threat that comes, the risks that are involved with the work, but we rely on a community that helps us mitigate those risks, that champions our work, and we consider ourselves unbiased, the same way that we talk about the violations, abuses, and horrific casualties as a result of groups, terrorist organizations. We also talk about the abuses and violations that are charged and led by the government as well. And that neutrality provides some protection, but I think that it's important to recognize that most people want to live in peace, and they want opportunity, and they want stability. And when we offer that, we do find ourselves shielded and cloaked by community support, but there are real sacrifices that come with the work that we do, particularly working at the front lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes for women everywhere. There's
Absolutely.
a question from Maxwell Boutros here. How do you feel about the increasing women participation in the militaries and paramilitary groups around the world? Does it hinder your work? Or is it an opportunity to demand women at peace tables as well? It's a bit of a conflict there, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? If more women get involved in paramilitaries and militaries in terms of the war effort, probably the wrong word, in terms of the militaristic approach, does that mean more women get to the table only in that capacity? So does it hinder this notion of including women, or does it actually create an opportunity? And I'd like to turn to Hija on this one, because that has been the case in Libya. You probably had experience, at least in reading about it and watching and looking in, that women were quite active in the military zone.
That's a very good question. If you would have asked me this question perhaps 6 years ago, I would have most, or maybe 7 years ago, I would have most likely said, well, let's not have women there, because why do we even need to emphasize this approach of we need the military to protect us? We need this militaristic approach to peace and security. But standing from where we are right now, 100% sure, in the sense of, yes, we do need women to be part of the security sector generally, whether that's the military, whether that's the police force, because, for an example, looking at the situation in Libya, these institutions and these sectors are definitely important when it comes to the stabilization of the country. And to give you an example, because it also links to whether it gets women to the table or not, if you look at the current peace process in Libya, or the political process, you will see that there is different track, and there is the military track, which is called 5+5, and it's 5 men from both sides of the conflict coming together and negotiating on security matters. And when we look at that table, one can very simply ask, where are the women? Because you have 10 men sitting in the room discussing security issues that affect the whole nation. And you can already see that half of it, which is women, are not represented there. So you can only imagine that when these men are sitting together thinking of the security threats that people face, the security need that people also need, what is needed to even stabilize the country from a purely security perspective, one can easily say that they're only bringing half the perspective of half the society and not all of it. So definitely, indeed, if we will have, which is apparently the case, security groups standing in the sense of security sectors, again, whether it's a police force, a military, or whatever it's called, then definitely women should be part of it. Because even if you think, for an example, security checkpoints, if there's going to be security checkpoints, we would rather have women also standing in these security checkpoints to assess the women who are passing, even when it comes to the simple thing of checking the women who are passing, whether that's on the street or whether that's at airports, for an example.
Okay, thank you. It's a big issue here as well in terms of reintegration, and we heard earlier in the discussion about the focus on young men in terms of keeping them away from paramilitaries, which is something, Emma, you're probably familiar with, and many others. But Also, I think there's an interesting comment from Amanda. So are we saying if women are more like men, they get to the table? And that's not what the table should be about. It shouldn't just be about the securitization. And therefore, that's where we include young men, young women, because whatever Graham Simpson managed to do in that report, he said there had to be a different lens taken. And it's the lens of resilience and peace building and sustainability. Emma, we're nearly coming up to the end of our time, but a question would be, how can the organisations work more closely together on this? I often found that we were in silos, we were different women's groups and young women's groups and young men's groups. We're all doing different things. And in this society that we're living in, which is, to really make this transition work from conflict to peace, we need to be on the same page, as you said. So how can we be more collaborative, which is the point that was made today, rather than competitive?
Yeah, and I suppose I would give that question out to our government leaders about investment and resourcing, because, and especially in the sector that I'm involved in, the community and voluntary sector, we are kind of left behind sometimes when it comes to funding. So, I mean, there's so much I want to do, and so much that needs to be done, obviously. And it's about that, I suppose, collaboration. And, I mean, the city that I live in is quite small, and I have been in Derry, Londonderry, and I think in some ways people think of young women's work and they just say Emma Johnson, but it shouldn't be like that. It's not specialist. It's about, having versatility as a worker, whether you find yourself in a team like the Equality Work with Young Women's team or not. Like, we should be harnessing young women. We should have the knowledge and recognition that there's a disparity between young men and young women. If you take our relationship and sexuality education in schools, young women and men start that by the age of 7. By the age of 7, you have already been affected deeply by things like gender stereotypes, by things like gender norms, and the things that exist that help, that tell us how we should be and how we should act. And I think that collaboration, what's key about collaboration is making those connections, but you have to have the desire to do it first and foremost. I can't be running around as one person, I suppose, like trying to inspire people to get involved in young women's work. Today, if nothing else, should inspire all youth workers that this is something that's real and something that we need to respond to. And I think somebody did mention there, I think it was Liz, about young men, are they supportive? And I think Brandon mentioned about masculinity and toxic masculinity. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done, by all of us to nurture children and young people and reach out and as somebody said in the previous session, to just make them feel comfortable in their own skin. Yeah. So so I suppose, I don't know if that really answered the question, but I think it needs to start with you. It needs to start with what you can do and then reach out to others and build those connections.
Absolutely. And some of the titles we've had today, Together We Build It, and some of the comments from Ilwad, be daring and innovative. We need support, give us a platform, realizing our potential, recognizing your independence, standing on your feet, what works, and the visibility, the intergenerational opportunities. Just so many important messages. Incredibly useful conversation this afternoon. And I'm going to bring it to a close now. And can I say it's been the easiest session I've ever chaired, because you've all stuck to your time and you responded to the questions exactly as you should, making my job so much easier. So thank you to you, the participants, for doing that, and to those who joined us earlier. And can I say thank you to all of those who joined us today on the chat line and in the audience. Most particularly also to those who've all led up to this, all the hard work that went into it. And it's made me very proud to be with the John and Pat Hume Foundation and a former chairperson of Interpeace, and indeed with the University of Ulster, and a big supporter of the International Fund for Ireland. So thank you to all of you. And to Graham Simpson, my good friend, and an enormous asset to Interpeace, whose initial Youth Peace and Security report seeded and planted the seeds that are now blossoming for this series, and for helping to secure you, the participants. I guess, Graham, if you're listening, whatever address book we used to, oldies like me, I don't know how you keep them these days, probably on your iPhone, but having that kind of data bank of networks must be worth millions, because you've brought us the most wonderful participants here today, and thank you for that. And to Brandon, my colleague also at the university, who's the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace. To Liz McArdle, who chaired brilliantly the earlier session in terms of her work at Youth Pact. She brings a richness to this as well. And to Myra McAloof and to Colette Cassidy, who were behind the scenes doing the communication, and as ever, to Alan Mabon, who did all the technical support. What would we do without you, Alan? Never ever a little wish or anything. So finally, to our partners, as I said, to the John and Pat Hume Foundation, International Fund for Ireland and Interpeace, can I say to all of you, fond farewell, and let us continue to build a more just and peaceful world. Thank you so much, and farewell.